Percents are a lot like fractions, where we have to have some kind of quote-unquote whole to understand parts. A fraction is typically a fractional portion of some whole number, and in mathematics we use that whole number as 1. But in percents, we think about the whole as being 100%. So 1 goes to 100%. In this case, if we ask what percent of a foot is 3.5 inches, then the whole is going to be the foot, or in other words, the base number, as it's kind of called in percentages, or in percentage problems. This really is going to be the whole, or base. That's what we're going to be representing as 100% of the problem, if that makes sense. Now, we're trying to compare to this whole, or to this base, some other quantity. In this case, we're comparing 3.5 inches. We're asking what is the percent that 3.5 inches is of a foot. Now, let's look at 3 inches. 3 inches to a foot. So 3 inches is what percentage of a foot? Well, we know a foot has 12 inches. So we're really asking 3 inches is a percentage of 12 inches. And of course, there's 4 3-inch portions in 12 inches. 3 times 4 is 12. So we know that 3 over 12 equals 25. Let me write it like this. 3 inches is 25%, because there's like you can think about 25 cents in a dollar is a quarter, or 25%. Hopefully that makes sense. 4 inches is what percentage of 12 inches, or in other words, of a foot? Well, there's 4 times 3, it makes 12. So we know there's going to be, each 4-inch portion is a third of a foot, or in other words, 33.33%. So 3.5 inches, which is going to be between 3 inches and 4 inches, is somewhere between 25% and 33.33%. Or you could say, yeah, it's probably close to 30. So this should be around 30%. How do we find that number specifically? Well, in this case, all we have to really do is take 3.5 divided by 12. Or in other words, we can take 3.5. 3.5 is just 3.5 divided by 12. And that gives us 0.2916, and there's just a bunch of sixes. And the way you find a percentage is actually all you have to do is move the decimal point twice. That gives us 29 point, I'm just going to round to 2 decimal places, 29.17%. That is what percentage 3.5 inches is of a foot. Okay, continuing. For landscaping an area, the grade of the hill affects the drainage of the soil, as well as how much sunlight hits the area. So the grade is the steepness of a slope, and the steepness here is written as a percentage. And a slope is the rise over run. It's a very common number to use in a lot of different areas. It's very important in mathematics, especially if you go into calculus. Slope is very, very useful, very important for that idea. Now, it's going to be a percentage here. The most important thing to note is the grade is the percentage of the slope. Then the slope is going to equal rise over run. In other words, a rise, so it goes up 20 feet, directly vertical 20 feet for every 70 horizontal feet that it moves. So that's the slope. That's not the grade though. The grade is the percentage. Now you can see that the feet cancel here, and we have 20 over 70. So the grade will equal 20 divided by 70, which is 0.2857, and then it continues on. I'm just going to round it to that place. So the actual grade is going to be a percentage. Move the decimal point 2 spaces, and we get 28.57%. That is the grade of this area. It's kind of a side note. What do you think a grade of 100% would be? So if a grade equaled 100%, what does that mean for the slope? Well, to have 100%, we would have to move the decimal point back 2 spaces. That means we would have 1.00 as the actual calculation, which means the only way we can get 1.00 is if we had 1 over 1, or you can think of it as 20 over 20, like in the previous case, 20 feet over 20 feet, or we could think of it as 70 feet over 70 feet. What's really important here is that we have the same run, so we can say like 20 feet, as we do rise 20 feet, which if you thought about it, that's going to be a 45-degree angle, which is quite a decent slope. So the most important part of this video is learning how to write between fractions, mixed numbers, decimals, and percents, those types of things. So after that introduction to percents, let's talk about actually doing the mathematics to convert between these types of quantities. Converting between decimal and percents is the easiest. I showed you that before. We just move the decimal point back and forth. Converting between fractions and percents, that takes a bit more work. To go from a percent to a fraction is actually quite simple. Going the other way, it requires multiple steps. So every single percent is out of 100. So we can think of this as 21% out of 100%. And you see that here we have the percents cancel. Now we always have to reduce this fraction, but this cannot be reduced at all. So this is actually quite simply 21 over 100. 5%, we can do this the exact same way. 5% out of 100%, those cancel, and we can divide top and bottom by 5, giving us 1 out of 20. 5% is the same thing as 1 out of 20. 14%, we can divide top and bottom by 2, giving us 7 out of 50, and that can't be reduced anymore. 130% over 100. Now you see that we actually have a mixed number here because this is now an improper fraction. Divide top and bottom by 10, we get 13 out of 10. And changing this to a mixed number, how many times can 10 go into 13? And go in there 1 time. 1 times 10 is 10. 13 minus 10 is 3, and you always leave it out of the same denominator, which will be 10. So 130% is the same thing as 1 3/10. Now 12.5%, this is a little weird because we have a mixed number, and normally you never see this as a mixed number. You always see it as a decimal, so it would really be 12.5%. But we can still continue. So I recommend changing this first into a improper fraction. 2 times 12 is 24, plus 1 is 25. So we have 25 over 2%. It's a little weird, but we can use the same process we did in the previous problems. Namely, 25 over 2 divided by, that's going to be a percentage of course, 100%. Percents cancel, and now we have a division with fractions. We never just divide by a fraction. We can divide by the reciprocal, multiply by the reciprocal. So we get 25 over 2, we get a little more room here, times the reciprocal of 100 over 1, or in other words, 1 over 100. Now we can cross cancel. 25 divided by 25 is 1, 100 divided by 25 is 4, and we get 1 times 1 on top, 2 times 4 on bottom. So 12.5% is the same thing as 1/8. All right, writing a percentage as a decimal, this is very easy. All you have to do is find the decimal point, which if it's not written, it's always at the very end there, and move it 2 spaces to the left. So 47% is the same thing as 0.47. Quite simple. 2 spaces to the left. 0.2635. 2 spaces to the left. In this case, it's going to be 2.19. That's because it's greater than 100%. 2 spaces to the left. This is a very small percentage, so it's going to be a very small decimal number. See, there's 3 zeros with a 2. Most important thing to note is that if there's any space that you're kind of not written there, right? Let me just go back and show you that. I moved it 1 space, and then I have to move it another space. There's no 0 written there. I'm just going to add a 0. And if there's not a 0 written in front of the decimal point, it's always good for practice to add a 0, just like I did in this problem here. I added a 0, just like I did in this problem here. 3.5%. Let's change this into a decimal number first. 3.5 is the same thing as 3.5. 1/2 is the same thing as 0.5. And now all we have to do is move it 2 spaces. I have to add a couple of zeros around it. So we get 0.035. That's how you go from a percentage to a decimal. Now to go the other way, well, that's quite simple. All we have to do first is move it 2 spaces to the right. So 0.33 is 33%. 0.04 is 4%. 2.51 is 251%. 6.8, I have to add a 0 here, so we get 680%. For 3, the decimal points are right here. It's always at the very end on the right-hand side. It's not written. Move it 2 spaces, add zeros in spaces that aren't written, and we get 300%. Now for fractions, the first thing you're going to do is change this to a decimal. How do we change a fraction to a decimal? You just do the division. 3 divided by 4. On a calculator, that gives me 0.75. And now we have a decimal number. Move it 2 spaces to the right, giving me 75%. 2/5 is going to be 0.4. 2 spaces. 2 spaces to the right, we get 40%. 1/10, it's going to give us 0.1. 2 spaces, we get 10%. Just plug this again. Plug it into your calculator, move it 2 spaces to the right. 1.8, I actually knew what 1.8 is. That's going to be 12.5%. But what you can do is just put it in a calculator. That's going to give us 0.125. 2 spaces to the right, we get 12.5% or 12.5%. It's pretty typical to write it as a decimal and not as a mixed number. 2 3/5. If you don't know, 2 3/5 is the same thing as 2 plus 3/5. 3/5 in your calculator gives you 0.6. So we have 2 plus 0.6, which gives us 2.6. 2 spaces to the right, we get 260%. So to go from a fraction to a percentage, change the fraction to a decimal and the decimal to the percent. To go from a percentage to a fraction, all you really have to do is just divide by 100% like I did in this first problem here. That's all I really did there, is divided by 100%. To go from decimal to a percent and vice versa, it's really just move the point 2 spaces left or right, depending. The decimal is always going to be a smaller kind of concept. As here in this first problem here, Let me rewrite it here. 47%, right? 47, the number 47 is much bigger than the decimal representation of 0.47. All you have to do is move it 2 spaces forward or 2 spaces backwards to go either way that you want to go there.